It is hard to believe it's December already, but here we are. Having spent the bulk of the year talking about landform myths from across the continent, I figured we could zoom in and look at things from another perspective, how these myths influence daily life. However, I don't live on the African continent anymore, and the Mythological African's annual budget at this time cannot support travel, so my best bet is to do another kind of traveling, and that is through books. Now, if you want to travel by book across the African continent in a way that allows for close contact with the land, where do you go to quite literally book this trip? Honestly, I don't know about other parts of the continent, but I do know that if you want to travel the Sahara region by book, you will find no better map and travel guide than the work of Libyan writer Ibrahim al Koni. If you're an MA insider, you know who Ibrahim al Koni is. I believe he is the world's best known Libyan writer and certainly one of the best writers to come from the continent. Ibrahim al Koni is from the Tuareg people, and the Tuareg are one of the African continent's desert nomads, so called because historically they live most of their lives in the desert. He was born in the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya and spent his formative years there living the typical lifestyle of his people. It involves a lot of travel across the desert, being in close-knit communities, rearing camels, music and dance and all of that. He eventually traveled to Russia to study literature and journalism, but maintained strong attachments to his Tuareg roots, and this is evident in all his works, which unabashedly centers the Tuareg people, their lives, and their stories. The Tuareg people are not the only characters in Ibrahim al Koni's work, however. The Sahara Desert, that sprawling landscape of hot, arid desolation, is just as big a personality as some of al Koni's most memorable characters. And I was going to do a fresh episode on the Sahara Desert as an introduction before we got to talking about Ibrahim al Koni's The Bleeding of the Stone, which is the book we're going to focus on this month. But as I thought about what to say, I realized that we already have several episodes in which we introduce the Sahara through Ibrahim al Koni's work. And so instead of reinventing the wheel this week, we're going to revisit one of those episodes and save the fun for later this month so that we can sprinkle the facts that we find out about this foremost of all African geographical landforms in other episodes. And so without further ado, the Sahara of Africa. Hello friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. If you are a writer or spend time among writers, the adage to write what you know is something you will eventually hear. There are, of course, merits and demerits to the advice, but one cannot deny the fact that in the hands of a skilled wordsmith, intimate knowledge of a subject, be it a person or a place or a people or a time or an idea, results in prose and poetry which evolves sentences, paragraphs, and stanzas from lines and blocks of words to vessels of wonder, stimulating, delighting, and even awing in the way that certain paintings, photographs, sculptures, or musical compositions do. This is the sense you get from reading Ibrahim al Koni's Al-Majaz or The Animist. It is a massive book, over 500 pages broken down into 2 volumes and 4 parts. But only a book of this size could possibly contain everything al Koni puts into it the way he does. I've spoken about this before. Reading Al-Majaz feels like having a long conversation with the Sahara Desert, and not just any conversation, one of those wide-ranging, depth-scoring conversations at the end of which you see the person you are talking with and yourself with eyes refreshed by the sheer complexity and beauty of what you've experienced. Egyptian writer and culture critic Ismail Fayed summarizes it beautifully when he says, one reads Al Koni's text as if one is seeing the Sahara unfold before his mind's eye with its harshness and strangeness, but also ineffable beauty. And this comes from his intimate knowledge of the topography, the climate, the flora, and the fauna of the Sahara Desert. But one also cannot talk about the Sahara Desert without talking about the sun under whose unrelenting, and what might even say obsessive glare that landscape wreathes and waxes into and out of being. And in Almajas, the sun and the desert are locked in a relationship that reads like one of those grand enmities of fact and fiction, but which eventually reveal themselves to be grand amours, grand love affairs, right? Each party aware of and perhaps a bit resentful of the other's ability to drill to the core and extract the essence of the other. And in this relationship, the wind, the mercurial rains, the plants and animals, and the humans are their children and other members of the household whose moods and movements depend on and whose loyalties are divided between these two vastnesses. In Almajas, the sun is a bit of a tyrant. It rises every morning to ascend to its eternal throne in the zenith of the sky, which Al Koni lyrically describes as the heart of space. And from there lashes the desert and its denizens with fiery weeps, drying out the air and ultimately unleashing the wind, known as the Qibli, which continues the work of provoking the desert by stirring up massive clouds of reddish dust which suffocate the landscape and eventually crosses the Mediterranean to fall as crimson rain in the southern part of Europe. The desert, on its part, resists the sun's tyranny in the way that creatures who know what it means to bear life do. It crafts features and gives its creatures with the ability to evolve better and better ways to adapt to their reality. There are the Retem flowers which know how to bid their time, shoring up resources to eventually bloom fragrantly and flagrantly, riotous in their determination to retain their claim on the land. There are underground reservoirs of water which spirit away enough rainfall to sustain the creatures that know just how to read the clues left by the desert, or when and where least expected bubble to the surface. There's Barbary sheep who can metabolize water from the scraps of vegetation which stubbornly spring from and cling to the craggy terrain of their habitat. And there are humans who, like all children born to parents with a contentious relationship, know how to survive by carefully reading the environment and adapting as needed. In Al Majaz, the desert has another peculiar gift, and one which it gives specifically to her human children, and that is the gift of wisdom, discerned from the silence and stillness of her voluminous folds. But the desert is a symbol of even more to Ibrahim al Koni. It is a symbol of the soul, he says in an interview. The desert is a companion of freedom. The desert is a companion of the noblest thing in human existence. So we must glorify the desert, kneel to the desert, pray to the desert, because every sign in the desert, it is a prayer for eternity. The desert, he says, is not only a symbol of human existence, but it is a symbol of the eternal in its noblest sense. It is not in vain that all great ideas come from the desert. It is cruel, of course, because freedom is cruel. It is non-existence, of course, because death is non-existence. But in some reality, behind death, if we believe that there is a truth behind death, if we believe in the immortality of the soul, then the desert is the only evidence in this world that can prove it. I include a link to the full interview from which this snippet comes in the episode notes. It's a translation from Arabic, a rough translation, but it's still a fantastic read on some notions of Tuareg philosophies about the desert. We'll stop here for this evening, but we'll be back next week with the first episode about desert-related lore and other ideas from Ibrahim al Koni's The Bleeding of the Stone. Thank you as always for listening.